What is puzzling is that the administration has not hastened to demonstrate conclusively that there is no cause for concern of our gold treasury. Indeed, if it is in a position to do so. Okay, he probably didn't say it in such a rather kind of sexy way, but I'm sure he gave a good shot. They should at least try to sound sexy when they're about to bend you over a table and just... Anyways, unfortunately, Duro did not accomplish his goal. The fact is, the gold belonged to the American people, not the Fed or the foreign interest. One thing is certain, the government could blow all this speculation off in a day, a few days. Audit, go in there, bring camera, show us the gold. However, the government has never done so. You can only conclude that the government will not show the world what it is. Why are they afraid? Well, when Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, his friends urged him to study the feasibility of returning to a gold standard as the only way to curb governmental spending. Reagan appointed a gold commission to study the situation, report back to Congress. The Gold Commission reported back to Reagan, 1982, with the following shocking revelation concerning gold. Representative Ron Paul, suggesting Americans' reserve may not be as robust as official claim, is calling for an independent audit of the gold held at Fort Knox and other facilities. Republican congressman, known for his fierce opposition to virtually everything Fed, says the public deserves to know what is behind the fortified walls of the American gold vaults, particularly in the gold case. Well, in case gold is ever reintroduced as a basis for U.S. currency, all the things that people are screaming about, kind of alternatively, well, if there is no gold, you're basing it on thin air, right? It'd be nice for American people to know it, and I understand that. If it's there at all, of course, public should know. However, we all can be assured that the U.S. Treasury owns nothing. All the gold was confiscated and stored at Fort Knox has been transferred to the Fed. Never before has so much money gone missing, stolen right from the hands of the public while they starved, and placed in the hands of private investors. Now, the IMF and the World Bank. Hear the sounds of the big marching bands walking in, raping you and your children. World War I. Under the guise of peace, international bankers made a plan to confiscate power. Right? Their big claims, as they always claim, that it would only be one big bank that would help the world. That they would stem the tide of world wars. The money changers, pushed for world government, stood on three legs. Sort of thing. Central bank to be called the Bank of International Settlements. The world judiciary to be called the World Court. That's in The Hague in Netherlands. And a world executive and a legislator to be called the League of Nations. Clinton, his mentor, wrote a book called Tragedy and Hope, Powers of Financial Capitalism, Far-Reaching Plan. Nevertheless, to create a world system of financial control. But this is it. This is the actual rulers of the world. This system was to be controlled by a feudalist fashion, by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret governments arrived at frequent meetings and conferences. The apex of this system was a bank for international settlements in Basel, Switzerland. Private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate the government by its ability to control the treasury, and they did so. Despite the pressure from international bankers and press that they controlled, a handful of senators had kept the U.S. out of these schemes. Without the U.S. participation, the system was doomed, as I was telling you. Now, incredibly, even though the U.S. rejected the World Central Bank, the New York Federal Reserve ignored the government, arrogantly sent representatives to Switzerland to participate in central bankers' meetings, right up to 1994, when the U.S. was finally and officially kneeled. You know, it goes with that story. We're not quite sure if we're supposed to roll up our sleeves or pull down our pants, depending on which. Are we at a checkpoint or are we at a TSA? You know, I always forget those ones. Either way, both actions officially were done. It's already done. Bankers resorted to the same old formula, right? To this end, Wall Street resurrected Germany through the treason banks that closely connected to the Harriman interest in New York, just as the Chase Bank assisted the financing of the Bolsheviks' Revolution, World War I. Chase banks, controlled by Rockefeller family, subsequently merged with Wahlberg's Manhattan Bank to form Chase Manhattan. Chase Manhattan merged with Chemical Bank of New York, making it the largest Wall Street bank during its time. Their strategy, working, of course, way before World War II was over. But the World Bank, back on track. 44 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, monetary, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were appointed with full U.S. participation. The Second League of Nations, renamed United Nations, that, if you've heard one of my Friday shows, I call the eighth beast of the apocalypse. That was approved in 1945. A new international court functioning as well. So listen to these names here. Realize what I'm talking about. With the World Bank, with the UN, with the Hague, okay? As well as effective opposition to these newly formed organizations prior to the war had subsequently evaporated during the war, which was the International Bankers' Plan all along. Organizations were repeating on a world scale the National Bank Act of 1864 and the Fed Act of 1913 had established the U.S. They created a banking cartel composed of the world's central banks, which gradually assumed the power to dictate credit policies of all the nations of all the world. Now, here we sit with all of this stuff. And the ones that are still taking their last breath and fighting it are being bombed as we speak. And just as the Fed authorized the creation of a new international fiat currency called Federal Reserve Notes, the IMF was given the authority to issue a fiat money. Not the good one, that like the greenbacks, but a bad one, called special drawing rights. The IMF has created an excess of $30 billion of special drawing rights. Member nations being pressured to make the currency fully exchangeable for SRDs, those special ones. In 1968, Congress approves laws authorizing the Feds to accept these monies as reserves in the U.S. to issue Federal Reserve Notes in exchange for these SDRs. What this means, in the U.S., SDRs are already the nation's lawful money. Already. SDRs already backed by gold as well, with 2/3 of the entire world's gold in the hands of the international bankers. The money changers can do whatever the heck they want in any way they deem most profitable. Voting power in the IMF gives the U.S. Federal Reserve and England's Bank of England control, effective control. Just as the Fed counts the amount of money in the U.S., the BIS, IMF, and World Bank control the money supply for the planet. And now that is ruled by Carney, who was Canadian, gone over there in charge of the Bank of England with all of the native money from here. It's gone now. It's gone. A repetition of the goldsmiths' fraud on a global scale, right down to central banks like the Fed, all different names of course, by three arms of the International Central Bank. Regulations put into effect in 1988 by the BIS required World Bank to raise their capital to 8% of reserve of liability by 1992. This increase in capital requirement put an upper limit to the fractional reserve lending procedures. So, what does this seemingly insignificant regulation that was made in a Swiss city mean to this planet? Means that banks cannot loan more and more money to buy more and more time before the next depression. As a maximum loan ratio is now set, it means those nations with the lowest bank reserves in their system have already felt the terrible effect of this contraction, as we have seen all over Europe, right? As their banks scramble to raise money to increase their reserves to 8%. To raise that money, nations had to sell stocks. Bought by who? It depressed the nations, of course. Began depressions in countries. 1988, Japan had one of the lowest capital reserve requirements, was the most affected by regulation, suffered a financial crash immediately. This requirement wiped out nearly 50% of its stock market since 1990, 60% of the value of the commercial real estate. Bank of Japan had to lower its interest rate to 1.5%, practically giving away money to resurrect their economy. Still, depression worsens, and due to $20 billion bailout of the U.S. to Mexico, the financial collapse of the nation is already in hand. Despite these bailouts, the economy is approaching disaster here. The huge debt is being rolled over as new loans are being made, simply to cover interest of old loans. Right? In the south of Mexico, every spare peso is siphoned out of the nation to make interest payments. It is important to note that the radical power exchanges are taking place all over the world. Nations are subservient to superpower central bank here, controlled by a handful of the world's richest people. As the IMF creates more and more FDRs by the stroke of a pen on a ledger of the IMF, more and more nations borrow to pay the interest of this mounting debt. Eventually, all nations, no matter how staggered they are or blind they are, will crumble openly, visibly, under this weight. Life and death of nations, as it alone will decide who lives and who dies, and what nation will die slow and what nation will die fast. And in spite of all the rhetoric about development and alleviation of poverty as a result of the steady transfer of wealth from the debtor to the money changer central banks, which control the IMF and the World Bank, well, but we are